Hello, everybody. I would like you all to join me in welcoming Liza Morse. Liza Morse is a PhD candidate at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources and a graduate fellow at the Gunda Institute for Environment at the University of Vermont. Her research interests broadly are in the role working forest landscapes play in supporting and sustaining biodiversity, ecosystem services, and rural economies. Her dissertation research investigates the impacts that maple sugaring has on Vermont forests, the ecosystem services they provide, and the bird communities they support. Liza is also conducting research with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, exploring the impacts of land sharing and land sparing approaches on bird diversity in coffee-growing landscapes in Colombia. When not looking at birds for research, Liza is probably looking at birds for fun, baking a cake, or hiking with her dog. Thank you very much, Liza.
Thank you. So I have only ever presented this to my dog, but this feels like a really friendly audience. So please feel free to interrupt with questions. I absolutely don't have this presentation down to the minute, so questions will not throw me off any game I may or may not have. As was just said, I am Liza. I'm a UVM student, and my passions personally are for bird conservation, but also for helping people who care about birds do right by birds. And so that's really why I care about working landscapes, because I feel like, unfortunately everywhere can't be a forest preserve. We have to figure out how to meet our needs as humans, how to have sustainable, meaningful livelihoods for people, but ones that also consider birds and other wildlife. So I created this kind of witty title, Bird-Friendly Maple Latte, because the two programs I work on have to do with maple sap and syrup production in northern forests, and coffee production. Specifically, I'm looking at Colombia, but obviously coffee production happens around the world. And these two systems really link many bird species, but in particular for us, they link migratory songbirds, because a lot of birds are spending their time during the breeding season in the maple production landscapes, and in the non-breeding season in these coffee production landscapes. So, yeah, as I just mentioned, a lot of these birds link these two regions. As you heard in many of the other presentations today, things are pretty bleak, and they're also bleak for migratory birds, and they're also bleak for eastern forest birds, which is why looking at these two landscapes on the eastern region of the U.S. And down into northern South America are really important if we care about our migratory birds in general, but our eastern migratory birds and our forest birds in particular. So in the maple producing region, there's a pretty stark overlap between species richness of birds during the breeding season and number of taps. So this is a really old metric. Unfortunately, there aren't a ton of really good region-wide sources of data for maple. It's kind of not well studied, but this gives you a good idea of where the major production centers are. So Vermont is the largest producer in the US. Obviously, this does not include the major Goliath to the north, which is Canada, which basically blows everybody out of the water, but we're just going to pretend they don't exist for the sake of this presentation. But so clearly we have to care about maple production and the expansion of maple production in northern forests if we care about breeding birds in the Northeast.
Can I ask a very simple question?
Yeah.
We're talking maple for syrup, not maple for lumber, right? Or are you
Yes,
talking like
correct.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a lot of the language is the same. There's actually kind of a little bit of some tension right now between maple syrup producers or sugar producers and foresters, because if you put taps in everything, you've just created subpar lumber. There is a market for what's called bird's eye maple, which comes from tapped maples, but it's not significant enough to compensate. So yes, there's some trade-off, but we're talking about, I mean sap, because a lot of producers don't actually boil, or they make something else that's not syrup, so it's a little complicated. But, and then we have the coffee producing region, which my work, which we'll discuss later in this presentation, is really focused on Colombia and the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is in this region. And as you can see from the global map of avian species richness, that's a a global hotspot, and then also overlaps, as you can see, with coffee production. So we got to care about these two regions, and especially because in both these regions, growth and demand are continuing to increase. So maple syrup production in Vermont has increased by 45% since 2012. This is a little bit of a complicated story because back in the day when everybody was a dairy farmer in Vermont, everybody was also a maple sugar maker. So we have this huge period where there was a lot of maple production, it went way down, and now it's climbing again. So I would say by no means are we back to what Vermont was, but the techniques are very different, the impacts on the forests are very different, and nobody really knows yet what those are, and that's why I'm asking the questions I'm asking. Obviously, coffee demand across the world is astronomical. Within the US alone, it's up by 5% since 2015. The average American coffee drinker drinks 3 cups per day of coffee, which I can say as a grad student, I'm probably on the high end of that range. And if 7 to 10 Americans are drinking coffee every day and they're drinking 3 cups of coffee every day, that's a lot of coffee. Oh, but the good news is that coffee drinkers care about getting ethically sourced coffee, right? So then we move into market-based conservation approaches. So we have the bird-friendly maple approach, your friendly local sugar maker, and then bird-friendly coffee, which is more of a supply chain, longer supply chain of coffee producers who are growing according to bird-friendly coffee standards, and then roasters who follow that supply chain along. Bird-friendly maple was started in 2014 by conservation biologist Steve Hagenbu at Audubon, Vermont. It has since expanded to New York and I believe Massachusetts and Maine and maybe Connecticut are also getting in on the action soon. The program is not a certificate, so technically to be a certificate you have to have third-party verification, so that's what your organic certifications are. But bird-friendly maple is basically educating maple producers on the importance of healthy forests to birds, providing technical support to maple producers, and recognizing maple producers for their efforts. So as we can see, forest fragmentation is, the worst version of events. Then we have our traditional sugar bush. So traditional sugar bushes are more simplistic, but they're still forests, right? So, you're buying maple syrup, it's still better for the environment than what we have. Let's see if my laser pointer works. Not so much. On the left. Yeah. Okay, so we have red on the left, orange getting better with the traditional sugar bush, and then we have our bird-friendly sugar bush. So, little audience participation here. Thank you. Can someone tell me some things they noticed between the photo on the left and the photo on the right?
Yeah.
Hobblebush. Yeah, great. That was a very deep cut.
What is hobblebush?
Hobblebush. So hobblebush is one of the shrub species. In that photo, it is. I've been told it's called hobblebush because settlers thought that it hobbled witches, which I then had a child tell me that's silly because witches can cast magic, so why does it matter? I was like, well, clearly early settlers were not as smart as you. But it's a very important species for some of our shrub nesting birds, shrub layer nesting birds like black-throated blue warbler. Yeah?
You have three layers.
Yes. Yes. You have that structural complexity. Importantly, on the left, not only are you lacking structural complexity that's important for birds, but you're also you also have what is basically a forester's nightmare, which is hay-scented fern. So hay-scented fern impedes the forest's ability to regenerate, which means not only do you not have these layers, you're not going to get these layers, and eventually down the road you're not going to have a sugar bush to tap. So it's sort of bad all around. The pro to the left is that you are not having any competing species with your target maple species. And it's just easier to walk around in the woods. Like if you're tapping and you have to walk through that, it's a pain in the butt. And we care because we care about all these bird species that need these different layers. So our wood thrush, they need the abundant saplings and small trees. Black-throated blue warblers need dense seedlings, that understory layer. Scarlet tanagers need a dense canopy cover with a diversity of tree species. So the bird-friendly guidelines are basically trying to encourage producers to move towards this more complex condition. With the idea that forests take a long time to develop, right? And so any changes you make in your forest today is not going to show up in forest structure for possibly decades to come. And so we don't want to punish someone who's inherited their sugar bush from their family, who has maybe managed it in a certain way for generations. It's just all maple, there's no complexity, and they care about birds, they're going to manage in a bird-friendly way. Well, we want to give them the recognition as long as they're making those changes. And so producers are required to have a current forest management plan. And then they get a forest habitat assessment from an Audubon biologist, and they use that habitat assessment to tweak the management plan to get the producer to a bird-friendly condition. Timber harvesting also has to be shaped around the nesting season to not impact nesting, and sugar bushes have to be part of a surrounding forest matrix. So there's a variety of structural conditions that need to be met. So there's understory cover requirements, a requirement for a minimum density of snags and cavvy trees, a requirement for a certain amount of down woody material. You'll hear some people say down woody debris or coarse woody debris is another term for that. Foresters get upset because it's not debris, it's material. It's good, we want it. And there's also some restrictions on harvesting methods. The most important thing that these guidelines cover is the percent of tree species. So sugar maple is the target species, and it's named very appropriately because it has the sweetest sap. So it has the most sugar per unit of liquid volume, and so then you have to spend less energy boiling it down. So a lot of sugar makers are really preferentially selecting for sugar maple in their stands, and that can lead to a monocultured condition, which is not great for many reasons. And so these guidelines are to ensure better diversity for birds, but also for resilience of forests in areas that are being converted to sugar bush. And I should say I use the term sugar bush. A sugar bush just refers to any forest stand that is tapped for maple. And then any non-native or invasive plants that are found on the habitat assessment, there needs to be a plan for managing those. So the program was initiated in 2014 and was based on some initial master's research by Steve Hagenbu, as well as various studies within the northern forest ecosystem. But those studies are not within a maple working landscape, and so those are mostly from either untapped forests or forests that are managed for timber. And so, come 2019, Audubon was thinking, well, it's been 5 years, we should probably do an efficacy study to just see, do the guidelines that we put in place actually do for birds what we want them to do for birds? The idea is that we're supporting birds during the breeding season. In an ideal world, you do lots of nest surveys and things that actually get at reproductive success in sugar bushes, because that's just an enormous amount of work and you can't cover the range of sugar bush conditions that you would want. We used point counts as an analog, point counts during the breeding season as an analog for breeding activity. But basically we surveyed 16 sugar bushes over 3 years. And these are some of my friendly technicians collecting seedling information on seedling diversity. But we conducted point count surveys at the center of each plot. So there were plots in a grid across sugar bushes. So sugar bushes could have anywhere from 5 to 100 plots depending on the size of the sugar bush. And then subplot data was collected at subplots on vegetation, vegetation metrics that match all of those requirements laid out in the bird-friendly guidelines, and then also some information on arthropod abundance and biomass. So we're still working through the data at this point, but what's interesting is that just initially looking at sugar maple versus non-sugar maple, we see that actually most of our producers are below that 75% mark. So anything we find with birds may or may not be a function of the percent maple. It may also be a function of all of these other structural elements. But it's just interesting to see sort of the range across all of the sites of percent maple, amount of sugar maple versus non-sugar maple. And what is interesting, and I don't have it on this figure unfortunately, but for the sites that have so little sugar maple, they actually had a lot of red maple, which is another species that is tapped by sugar makers. And so it may be that actually when we look at the results, Audubon might want to consider adding red maple as one of the requirements, or like a limit to red maple, because it could be that sugar makers are getting around this 75% sugar maple requirement by simply just having red maple as the other species.
Ask a question.
Yeah.
Can you go back to that?
Yeah.
So what you're trying to see here is you would prefer to have 25% red and 75% green. Is that what you are shooting for? Is that
So at minimum, you have to have 25% other. Like, so green is all species, and so you want to have 75%. You want to have 75% or less in the red.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So then this is a little bit confusing because this is just at the point level. So if we go here in a second, you'll see the numbers are very different. Basically, species richness at the point level, you're seeing that there's not really a relationship between species richness at the point level, which these are what are called limited distance point counts. You sit at a point and you count birds within a 50-meter radius. So it may just be that that is not a relevant area to measure birds by within this system. So we're seeing not a whole lot of relationship between these. But when you look at tree species diversity and bird species diversity at the site level, there does seem to be a connection. So more at a landscape scale, or at least at a stand scale, birds seem to be attracted to stands with higher levels of species diversity. So the next step, also my words got cut off a little there, but the next step is to survey untapped stands and compare them to traditional sugar bushes and the bird-friendly sugar bushes that we surveyed. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to coffee now. Does anybody have any maple questions? Okay, so bird-friendly maple recognition program. Bird-friendly coffee and cocoa now is a certification program because they have a third-party certifier. And that guarantees traceability along the supply chain. There are third-party farm inspections. And just like the bird-friendly maple, there's science-based criteria, and it promotes farming systems that conserve biodiversity. So most of us get coffee from the image on the left. So sun-grown, high production, high inputs of chemicals and whatnot, but very efficient. On the right, shade-grown coffee is what's known as an agroforestry system. It's a mixture of an agricultural crop with a forest component, a overstory tree component. Shade-grown coffee is a very mixed bag, but in general, it has more similar bird diversity to natural forests. It has generally the highest diversity of migratory birds, so migratory birds really like shade-grown coffee in the non-breeding season. And then, so it has good things about it. The challenge is that it's not a certification. So bird-friendly is a certification, shade-grown is a label that is vaguely greenwashing. It means what it says it means, but there's a lot of variability in what that could be. So all of these approaches are shade grown, from a single tree species over the coffee plants, all the way up to what's called a rustic polyculture, which is effectively we've planted coffee in a forest. So when you buy shade grown, it's always better for birds, but you don't know where in that spectrum it falls. So the bird-friendly criteria was born to try to create some validity of where your coffee is falling within this spectrum. I'm not going to read all these requirements, but from the bird-friendly maple requirements, you get the general idea. It's encouraging tree species diversity, structural diversity within a coffee farm. And interestingly, this is the criteria for across the coffee producing range. So this is the same as in Africa as it is in South America. Obviously, the only difference is that, what is a native tree in South Africa or wherever you're producing coffee is not going to be the same as in Colombia, which is where the work I'm going to be talking about is taking place. So, brief vocab lesson, land sharing, land sparing. I don't love this graphic. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a better one in the time before this presentation, but basically, the graphic on the left, the land sharing graphic, is showing what many of us are trying to get when we buy organic. We want a natural farm that incorporates pollinator strips and feels good and has wildlife friendly components built into it. And I'm saying that in a certain kind of tone because unfortunately, even though I am equally sort of seduced by that imagery, the literature just hasn't really borne it out in terms of benefiting wildlife to the same degree that land sparing does, which is to really intensify agriculture on a much smaller geographic footprint and then leave the rest of it alone. The challenge is that the approach on the right requires a lot of chemical inputs and may be much worse for other things like water quality. So there's no approach that is better for all things, but unfortunately the approach on the left feels really good, but maybe isn't always really good. The challenge is that land sparing, intensifying agriculture doesn't necessarily guarantee that you are sparing land somewhere else. It could just be more agricultural intensification. And so collaborators, particularly Jonathan Valente with the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, just recently published this study looking at how bird species diversity varies between land sharing and land sparing approaches in Colombian coffee landscapes. So what they did was they collected field data in these coffee landscapes. But you can never get the perfect coffee landscape that has all the combinations of the elements you want. So what they did was collected all this field data and then basically simulated coffee landscapes using that bird and vegetation data. And so we get these landscapes that are a complete land sharing landscape where the coffee farm is all shaped. So let me explain this figure a little better. The wider matrix, the wider box with the green is the surrounding forest region, right? Because we know that region-wide forest composition can affect birds in a given space. The box in the center is the actual coffee farm. So the land sharing approach is all shade coffee over the entire farm. On the top right is a gradient of land sparing approaches where you have sun coffee, which is the yellow, with varying amounts of forest within the farm. So the spared land. And then there's a hybrid approach which they're looking at, which is shade coffee mixed with forest. And the reason that we're looking at this is, should we be altering the bird-friendly certification to include more of these different types of approaches? So I'm not going to go over this figure a whole lot, but just to say results are mixed. Again, land sharing is not always better, land sparing is not always better, and it varies between breeding and non-breeding season. So on the graph here you have the land sparing approach in a light blue, the hybrid approach in like a pink color, and the zero dash line is the land sharing approach. So you see in some cases diversity of land sparing and the hybrid are higher than land sharing, and in other cases it's lower. And that actually can also change as the percent of the landscape in the coffee farm transitions is allocated to forest. So what I wanted to ask was so we know how species diversity, I should say the important takeaways of this are also that land sparing, the sun-forest combination approach, is better for forest specialists in general. So we care about birds that really need true forest. We gotta produce our coffee here and leave the forest alone elsewhere. But in the non-breeding season, birds, particularly migratory birds, seem to prefer shade coffee. So we're seeing this complementarity of approaches for supporting birds that are breeding in tropical landscapes versus birds that are overwintering in tropical landscapes. So then the question is, we know what species diversity is doing. What is functional diversity doing? So how does bird functional diversity vary between these approaches? Functional diversity is basically, you can think of, functional traits are basically morphological traits, or they can sometimes be sort of lifestyle characteristics. So is it an insectivore? Is it a carnivore? How long is its tail? These are all examples of functional traits. These are the functional traits I included in my analysis. That slide got hidden. There it is, that's the one I wanted. All of these traits are thanks to a recently published database on all of the birds of the world. So basically every bird in the world, they've measured birds from museum specimens and combined them into an average for each species. So it's a game changer for this type of analysis. This is just a cool figure from that paper, you don't have to understand that. But basically, what we can do is spit out these different functional diversity metrics. So I'm gonna focus on functional richness. So I created an amendment of this actually legit figure with some little bird cartoons to basically get at, I wish this laser pointer worked on the screen. Functional richness, when you're conceptualizing the metric, you have a bird with a certain combination of functional traits that forms one edge of your, what's called your functional space. So you have a flamingo, and then you maybe have another crazy out there bird with very different morphological traits, which is your peacock. And then you have another one, which is your owl. But then you have another owl in your data, and it's similar, it falls within the range of traits for all the other birds. So that exists within the trait space. So basically we're conceptualizing what is the size of this trait space in different bird communities. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah.
Okay. So what we did was we took Jonathan Valente's data, used their occupancy modeling. So basically with birds, you can't always detect a bird just because it's there. And there's lots of complicated math to basically figure out, is the bird there, I just didn't detect it. That in combination with the landscape simulation, which we talked about before, creates these what's called occupancy rates for birds. So what is the likelihood that a bird exists in the coffee landscape? That combined with the trait data for each of those bird species gives us functional richness. So this was we used the 100-hectare landscape, 100-hectare landscape farm size, and simulated a bunch of basically feasible but theoretical landscapes. So what we found is, not super surprising. Species richness is greater for shade. So this is with sun or shade coffee with no forest in the farm. So we have greater species richness for shade coffee than sun coffee in both the breeding and non-breeding season. And then interestingly, we have greater functional richness in shade coffee than in sun coffee. We kind of would expect that. It is possible to have greater species richness, but lower functional richness if the birds that are migrating into a community are more similar to the birds that are already there. So for an example is in Hawaii, unique endemic birds go extinct, non-native birds move in, but the non-native birds aren't as unique as the birds they're replacing, and so species richness stays the same, but functional richness goes down. So it's just another way to understand what are the effects our use of the landscape is having on birds. Where am I at for time? Okay, just want to leave enough time for questions. Here we're looking at sun coffee versus shade coffee again, but with different proportions of forest in the landscape and between the breeding and non-breeding season. So what we're seeing, it's a little difficult to see because it's kind of squished together, but you can kind of notice in the species richness graphs to the left, for both the breeding and the non-breeding season, there's kind of a parabolic shape of increase to both of the types of coffee, and that tracks with what's called an intermediate disturbance hypothesis, where at intermediate levels of disturbance, you get more species. So an example is, I'm sure there's many birders in the room. When you want to get a lot of species, you go somewhere where there's a lot of different habitat types together, or it's kind of patchy. You don't go to deep forest when you want to get the most birds on your list for the day. So that's the kind of idea here is we have at these middle amounts of forest, we have enough forest that forest birds are present, but not so much forest that these other species drop away. What is confusing, and frankly, I don't have a good explanation for it, is why sort of the opposite is happening for functional richness. It may be that at lower levels of forest, you get the functional richness of forest birds with the functional traits of open area birds, and then those drop away as you get more forest. That's something to sort of tease out as we pull out the different specialist groups in the analysis. So the next step is to do that kind of analysis, is to look at, are we seeing a unique effect in insectivores? Are we seeing a unique effect in granivores? And then to also play with these different combinations of forest structural elements. So, now that you know that bird-friendly maple and bird-friendly coffee are generally better, if you're interested in purchasing either of these things, both Smithsonian and Audubon have a website where you can find producers, distributors, etc., to purchase these products. But again, like I said, shade, if you either can't afford or can't find a distributor for any of these things, maple is just generally a good thing to support in terms of forest conservation. But shade-grown coffee is always a better bet than sun-grown. And with that, I just want to acknowledge all my collaborators, particularly my collaborators at Smithsonian and Audubon and Vermont Center for Eco Studies, who are the partners on the bird-friendly maple program, and all my wonderful techs, without whom data collection would not have been possible. So, thank you all for being such a great audience. Any questions?
Yeah. What does, how does either shade grown or non-shade grown, how does it affect the quality of the coffee room?
Yeah, I am not a coffee snob. I feel like shade grown seems to be the preferred, but one thing I hear, so Ruth Bennett, who was on that earlier slide at Smithsonian, always beats the drum of, you have to have quality. Like, it doesn't matter how good for the world something is, if it doesn't taste good, people aren't gonna buy it. So they really care about, Smithsonian they're not the producers. There are plenty of distributors who roast bird-friendly coffee, and obviously there's probably an array of quality across them, but because it's a costly product to make and sell and purchase, I would hope that they're putting some care into it. I like bird-friendly coffee. I don't think it tastes better or worse. Yeah. If you have a very refined palate, maybe you can tell me.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. Do you know the magazine, the Northern Woodlands?
Yeah, well, if you're asking me about the article that was in there, that was my project.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And for anybody here, if you're interested in birds or almost anything else about the wilderness, get that magazine, Northern Woodlands. We've gotten it for about 10 years, and it's by far the best magazine we've ever gotten. I read every single article, and there's no other magazine will I read the whole business.
Yep, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And actually, their old editor is at Vermont Center for Eco Studies, where my collaborator is. So there's a lot of cross-pollination.
No, it was an excellent article.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, do birds eat coffee beans?
That's a great question, because coffee beans are a fruit. So I don't know if there are any native frugivores that eat coffee beans, but
yeah.
I don't believe so.
No, okay. You wonder if it would affect them the way it affects us. We'd have nervous birds.
Yeah, well, I bet there are birds I'm not sure. It's either that coffee is indigenous to one of the areas that it grows,
Africa.
right? Africa, okay. Yeah, I should know this, thank you. So I would imagine in Ethiopia, right, there are birds that are eating coffee beans, but I don't know. It's possible because we have birds here who are eating non-native plant species, but yeah, I haven't. That is not one of the appealing things about bird-friendly coffee is that you are encouraging birds, which helps with pest control. I feel like like if birds were affecting your bottom line in terms of actually eating your product, it would be a harder sell.
Did you say something about cocoa?
So yeah, they just launched a bird-friendly cocoa
So we should look for the
certification.
label, or it's gonna be a while?
I think it's gonna be a while. And I don't know, like, the guidelines are obviously not the same. But yeah, I think it's gonna be a little while. But they are ramping up on presentations and outreach about it, so I feel like, yeah, it'll be soon. But yeah, that website that I had up before is a good, Smithsonian will have online information about bird-friendly cocoa as well, if you're interested. Yeah.
Are there any species that do better in those large, open kind of monoculture, like from the photo you showed earlier?
Right.
You know, the birds that do better in those kinds of environments, the more developed than the shade-grown areas?
Yeah, so the answer is yes. The problem is those aren't species we're worried about. You know, the agriculture is always going to be around, and therefore the species that do well in sun coffee are always going to be around. What's sort of under threat are the forest specialists. And so what the results from the Valente paper would suggest, and then potentially what the results from my work will contribute to, is whether or not there should be a shade-grown coffee, bird-friendly coffee stamp, and then maybe not a different stamp, maybe just also bird-friendly is a, you know, intensive sun-grown, but then like the rest of the farm is protected forest. So there's gonna have to be some development of what percentage does that have to be, and how do you ensure that sparing is really happening, and they weren't just gonna only convert 5 acres to coffee anyway, and there's probably a lot of conversations that are gonna have to go into that.
Great, well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Happy to.
Are there any coffee makers like the big name Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts that have made the leap?
I don't think so. Dean's Beans out in the hall, I went to high school with his daughter, so I have a very personal connection there. A lot of producers like them will make a bird-friendly coffee roast. Birds and Beans, all of their coffee is bird-friendly. At this point, part of the benefit to producers is that they get a price premium, and so I don't think Starbucks is trying to pay that price premium. Maple producers under the bird-friendly program don't get a price premium, or at least some maple producers might say they can get a price premium, but what a lot of them have told me just anecdotally is that it's more about making their products stand out and getting a larger market share than it is about getting more. But I think the difference between a 75% sugar maple and 60% sugar maple stand is less extreme and therefore less costly than shade grown versus sun grown coffee. So.
Is there any effort to add an overstory or you know, restore some of the forest in these full sun coffee farms to like maybe possibly mimic like early successional forest habitat on top of?
I think that the varieties of coffee are slightly different. Pan's nodding. I don't know enough about the coffee plant itself, but I believe it's a slightly different variety, and so I don't think you could just slap some trees onto it. And also, you've probably done a lot of work to clear that land. Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for you, but I don't think the solution is probably going to come from converting a lot of sun-grown back to shade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, have you started trying to talk to Canada yet about maple? Is anybody
Actually, yes.
working on them?
Yes. If anybody wants a fun documentary, there's a series on heists on Netflix, and one of the episodes is there's a big maple heist where in Quebec they like stole all this maple syrup because there's basically there's a organization that controls what's called this National Strategic Reserve of maple syrup. And basically, as a maple producer in Canada, you're more or less required to sell your maple to the Federation or whatever it is. And then they keep a certain amount in reserve every year. That way, if there's a bad year, they always have enough. And there was actually a study done by like a private firm on the ecological implications of maple, and there were a lot of graphics that were big on promises and short on any sort of actual data. So I reached out to them and asked if I could see the actual report and not just shiny graphics, and they wouldn't share it with me. So they just said it was internal, and I was like, okay. So, and a lot of them also publish in French. So, and I don't speak French, so.
Someone should reach out to the Canadian NGOs and see if they work.
Yeah, I mean, I just also wonder, you're starting to get into boreal, like, their forests that they're tapping might be slightly different.
But they're mostly in southern.
Right,
So
yeah.
it's kind of like New England.
Is creating clearings in some of the Vermont forests, clearings within the sugar bush or on the edge of the sugar bush, part of enhancing this habitat, or
Yeah.
or did I miss that?
No, you didn't miss it, but you made a very correct inference. If I can get us back there, oh my goodness. So, yeah, to get from, I think this is one of the things that's, for me, as like a recovering tree hugger, is, like, I don't like the idea of cutting down trees either, and when you see a cut, it can be really traumatic. Like, you're like, oh my God, you know. But for some species to take, you need what's called scarified soil. You need what naturally would be like a blowdown, and now there's exposed roots and soil, and that's where things like paper birch and other species that have airborne seeds that land and they need to touch dirt in order to start. So you can create those conditions with forestry practices, and for the most part, we as humans don't like disturbances that we didn't plan. So most people actually have done things in forests that suppress those kind of disturbances, which is exactly what happens in sugar bushes, which leads to lower levels of tree diversity. So sometimes you need to go in and do those cuts that create, and that's one of the things that is often hard to get sugar makers to do, because it means cutting maples that are their bread and butter. And so that's part of what the bird friendly program, you know, some of those tweaks to those forest management plans could be like, hey, you need to do a cut in 5 years at this location.
Then it creates some bird nesting habitat.
Right, exactly. The key is to just not do it during that nesting window. The other challenge, you notice all the blue lines going through the woods? That's what most sugar bushes look like now. Most people are not doing the buckets thing. It's a lot of work. People don't have as many babies to help them as they used to. And a lot of sugar makers, that's not their main gig. They have other jobs. So the tubing really saves a lot of time and allows for a much greater amount of production. But what it means is that if you want to cut down trees, you have a lot of things that could fall under, or your tubing could be damaged during harvesting, and so often sugar makers will wait till they have to replace all their tubing after a certain amount of years before they do a cut. And right now, that timeline isn't crazy, but the plastics are getting way better, which means now the timelines of the cuts are way longer, which means it's starting to be concerning of like, we're just gonna have maple monocultures. So, yep.
Can you speak to climate change and maple production and where maple growth is coming down, where it's going to migrate to, number one, and number two, this is a dumb question, but do those blue things get in the way of animals?
Okay, that's not a dumb question. That's the question I get every single time I hear. And so I wish that I had time to do a big mammal study. I have thought about getting existing moose collaring data and looking at, are they just avoiding sugar? You know, I can't prove that they're not going into sugar bushes with that data necessarily, but it would be interesting to see if they never step foot in a sugar bush. The problem is in Vermont they only collar calves and sows, and the ones we're most concerned with is the males coming into the sugar bush with their big racks. So yeah, anyway, I think that's for another human to do, but I have both seen moose walk successfully through sugar bushes, and I've also heard of people having their lines get caught in antlers. So it really, I think the other thing is that sugar makers really are all over the map of where they put their tubing. So some people like to put it way down low because they like to step over. And then other people like to mountain bike in their sugar bush, so they put it up really high so they can have mountain biking trails. And there I'm like, well, probably the mountain bikes are scaring away wildlife more than the tubing is. But a deer, a bear could absolutely, get through there.
And the climate change question?
The climate change question. So that's one of the other non-bird things that I'm looking at. Not so much where sugar maple is going or how it's going to fare, but how does sugar bush management affect the resilience potential of sugar bushes as forests? So there are various traits we know that plants have that make them resilient to disturbance, and so I'm going to be asking questions about that. In terms of the sugar maple question, there are models, just like there were models in the plenary today, of what's going to happen with climate change that are all over the map of what's going to happen with sugar maple. Obviously, as was also mentioned earlier today, plants can't just pick up and move. So the sugar maples are going to continue to exist in their current range for a long time. They might just start to decline in certain areas. And I also think that we're going to see sugar makers have to transition to tapping red maple, because red maple is predicted to be a total winner in climate change. It's something that people in the southern range of sugar making are already doing, and it's a thing that Vermont sugar makers either won't do or they won't admit to doing. So there will have to be a cultural shift in the puritanism or purist sentiment around just having sugar maples. Red maples produce comparable amounts of sap, or actually, they produce comparable amounts of syrup because they produce way more sap. So they produce just a ton more liquid, and the challenge used to be that meant way more boiling. Now we have RO systems, so we can just remove a bunch of the liquid ahead of time and then boil. You have to boil to get that flavor, but you can take a lot of the liquid out ahead of time and it saves a lot of energy.
And is it qualitatively different?
Abby Vandenberg, who's a big deal in the maple world, is on my committee, and she's doing work right now to look at flavor, but I don't think every state thinks their maple syrup is the best, and Vermont maple syrup is the best. But could I tell you, oh, that producer definitely taps mostly red maple and that one taps mostly sugar maple? Almost certainly not.
Well, I think that's all the questions we have time for before the next session,
Thank
but
you.
thank you very much, Liza.